Wait a minute. Am I the only one that got hyped up from that? The greatest sports movies, a combination of them. And the question is, what made them so inspiring? It's because that we want our lives to count. We want our actions to matter. We want to be part of something bigger than ourselves. We want to make a difference. We want to be the players in the game, not sitting on the bench. We want to make an impact. So here's my question for you. Are you? Are you making an impact? Am I? Am I making an impact? Heavenly Father, Lord, I ask that you send your Spirit here today to help us to get off the bench, to help us to make an impact in this world. Thank you. In your Son's name, amen. So last week we started this series called On the Mount, to walk through the Sermon on the Mount. It'll be 14 weeks. Now, there will be a hiatus next week. I won't be here. But then I'll be back for the final 12 installments of this sermon series. This week, we're going to look at what Jesus had to say about influence, difference-making, living a life of significance. What Jesus said about becoming the kind of person whose presence is felt in this world. And let me read you what he had to say. And on the surface, it may seem kind of tame, but as we start digging into it, you're going to see that this passage has some teeth to it. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. So how do you become that person of influence? Jesus says it's simple. You become the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And now, that doesn't sound like much of a hockey speech, so let's dig into it a little bit. He starts off with being the salt of the earth. You see, in Jesus' day, salt was one of the most useful and important elements that there were. But it wasn't for making food taste better or seasoning of food. In fact, in Jesus' day, that wasn't even the primary purpose for salt. Back then, the main use for salt was to keep their food from spoiling. They didn't have refrigerators. They didn't have freezers. You couldn't buy things in cans. So they used salt to keep their food from spoiling. So, for example, if you had a piece of meat or veggie meat and you couldn't eat it right away, you rubbed salt into it to make it last longer. And that salt, when rubbed in, would keep the meat from decaying. It would keep it from going bad. So when Jesus said that we should live a life that was salt to the earth, he meant that we should live a life in such a way that our very presence in the world acts like salt. There's a book that came out by Alan Weissman called The World Without Us. Weissman explored humanity's impact on this planet by asking the question, asking us to envision the earth without an ongoing presence of humans. It's a fascinating book, and in it you find out how our massive infrastructure would collapse and would finally vanish without a human presence. Just days after humans left this earth, floods in New York City subways would start eroding the city's foundations, and how the world's cities would start to crumble. Asphalt jungles would then give way to real jungles. And I found a video clip that kind of gives a visual taste of this. We often hear about the impact we have on this world, and we do have, quite frankly, a negative impact on this world, but I've never really thought about the impact on the world if we weren't here. And it's interesting to think about that, to see the impact if we weren't here. But it also raised a question in my mind. What would happen if all of the Christian influence were withdrawn from this world tomorrow? How long would it take before the world felt the effects? If there was no longer any salt being applied to the world, how long would it take? John Stott once wrote this. He said, "The world is putrefying. It cannot stop itself from going bad. Only salt introduced from the outside can do this. The church is set in the world as a salt to arrest, or at least to hinder, the process of social decay. God intends the most powerful of all restraints within society to be his redeemed, regenerate, and righteous people. We are the salt of the earth." Now, most of us, probably many of us, don't think that our life can have that much of an impact on the world from the decaying that's going on. We tend to think that, what role can I have as an individual? What difference can I make? We think that individual acts by just ordinary people are not that important. So the idea of our role preventing societal decay and thus making a difference in this world is not taken very seriously. We don't consider ourselves like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. or we are no Nelson Mandela. We don't consider ourselves to be on that level. If you think that way, you're wrong. Jesus wanted to know that we're wrong in that thinking. That's why he gave this challenge to be salt. He knew that what would matter most would be the countless, seemingly small individual acts from people like you and people like me that would make a cumulative difference. And he's absolutely right, as you see played out in some of the most basic situations. In the 1980s, New York City was in the grip of one of the worst crime epidemics in history. But then, suddenly, and almost without warning, from a high in 1990, the crime rate in New York City dramatically declined. Murders dropped by 2/3, felonies by 50%. And the most intriguing idea as to why it happened is a theory called the broken windows theory. It was a brainchild of criminologists James Q. Wilson and George Kelling. They argued that crime is the inevitable result of disorder. If a window is broken and is left unrepaired, people walking by that window will conclude that no one cares and that no one is in charge. Soon, more windows will be broken, and a sense of anarchy will start to spread from building to the streets in which they face, sending a signal that anything goes. The idea is that crime is contagious. It can start with a broken window, but can then spread to an entire community, which means the little things matter, which is exactly how New York City dealt with the problem. A war was waged on the broken windows, on the graffiti. This cleanup took place from 1984 to 1990, but it started to spread all the way throughout the city. Seemingly little things such as stopping the turnstile jumping in the subways, getting rid of the squeegee men at the intersections, to cracking down on public drunkenness, littering. Those seemingly little things added up. They took care of that, and the crime decreased through the whole city. That's what Jesus is after in our world. When we live like salt, it impacts the world around us in disproportionate measure. We are the mended windows. We are the graffiti being taken, scrubbed off, and taken away. But make no mistake, it's acting out in those little ways that then leads to big events and big moments, big opportunities. The little things don't just add up to big things. They can be seized by God, and they can become massive things. I think of a 42-year-old woman who was on her way home from work one cold December day. It was a day like any other day for her. She got on the bus, paid her fare, and sat down. She was just glad to sit down because her legs were tired after a long day. And as the bus started to fill with other passengers, the driver turned around and looked at her and told her that she was going to have to move. You see, this was 1955. She was African American, and those seats were reserved for white people. But she just sat there and didn't move. You see, she wasn't an activist. She wasn't a radical. She was just a quiet, conservative, church-going woman with a nice family and a decent job as a seamstress. But still, she didn't move. Maybe it was the injustice of it all. Maybe it was the years of persecution and abuse that she and millions of others had suffered for no other reason than the color of their skin. Maybe she was tired of being treated like a second-class citizen, having to drink from certain fountains, go to certain bathrooms, being forced into certain schools. Whatever it was that ran through her heart and mind that day, one thing was clear. She knew it was wrong. So she just did a small little thing and sat there. The driver began yelling at her, telling her to move. The other passengers began yelling at her, pushing at her, swearing at her. But she stayed right where she was. The driver stopped the bus, got off, and called the police. When the police arrived, they hauled her off to jail. But what they really did that day was they hauled her off into history. You see, that woman's name was Rosa Parks. And when she took her stand for what was right, or rather her seat for what was right, the entire civil rights movement was ignited. She didn't get on that bus looking for trouble. She didn't get on the bus for a planned attempt to make some kind of political statement. She just wanted to go home like everyone else. And as a Christian, which she was, she knew that she was made in the image of God. She knew that she had dignity and worth. And for a wonderful, eternity-filled moment, she was the salt of the earth. That kind of salt from one person can change the world. You can be salt anywhere, and you should be salt anywhere. I mean, let's bring it down to the lowest level. You can be salt in the checkout line at the grocery store. You can be salt online, and this is probably where it should most be used, online when you post something on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. You can be salt in your neighborhood. You see, that's the only way to make a difference. But Jesus wasn't done there. He also called us to be the light of the world. What is it about that? What's being light of the world all about? Whereas salt is taking a stand, light is revealing what's real. It's about showing the way. Letting our light shine is having what Christ is doing in our life and the truth about what Christ wants to do in everyone's life. Let that be wildly known. Let's say that you were diagnosed with a rare form of cancer. There was no known cure, and they only gave you a short time to live. But then a new experimental drug came out. You found out about it, and you gave it a try, and within 3 months, completely cured of cancer. And then you find out that someone you know has been diagnosed with that same kind of cancer. Would you even think about not telling them about that treatment? Would it even enter your mind to not let them know about what you have discovered? Of course not. That would be unthinkable. Telling them would be the most natural thing in the world to do because you know it could save their life. I assume you see where I'm going with this. Jesus, having a relationship with him is that cure. There are people in your life that have the disease of sin, uncurable, except through the treatment of Jesus. Telling them about Jesus should be the most natural thing in your life. And that's what Jesus meant when he said, to make a difference in this world, you need to shine your light. People are out there in darkness. Let your light shine. And that light is the message of Christ, that he came into this world to show us the way to live and to provide the means to be in a relationship with him. Think of it this way. Salt is the negative influence, meaning that it takes something away, whereas light is a positive influence. It's trying to bring something to others. But both of them, the salt and the light, are needed in order to make an influence in this world. You can't just be the salt. You can't just be a light. You have to be the salt and the light. We have to work against both moral and cultural decay. We have to work for truth. We have a double task to do, to stop the decay and to spread the truth. A call to serve the least and the lost. The least are those who are being victimized by injustice and want, need, and cruelty. The lost are those who are in need of the light of Jesus to find their way back to God. But that can't be where we leave it. Because if you remember Jesus' language, he didn't just want us to teach this message. His challenge was for us to be the salt, to be the light. He said, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. In essence, what he's saying is, you and only you can play the part in stopping the world's moral decay. You and only you can shine the light right where you are. There is a salt and there is a light that each and every one of us has been given. No one else has the same mixture of salt and light as you do. You have been entrusted with that salt, with that light. And it's only you that can bring that salt and light to this world. So what's it going to be? The challenge here isn't for the world to get its act together. The challenge is for us to be who God has enabled us to be. Jesus says that if the salt loses its saltiness, if it doesn't function like salt anymore, then it's worthless. Don't let that be said of you for not being the salt. Some people seem to think that the goal is to retain as much salt in themselves as possible. They seem to think that the way to be the salt is to keep it. Because if you give it away, you're not as salty. That's not what this says. It's the exact opposite of what Jesus says. Jesus was saying that the way to lose your saltiness, the way to be irrelevant in this world, the way to have no influence at all, to make your salt and your life meaningless, is to never have it interact with the decay in the world. If you don't let your salt interact with the decay around you, it will lose its saltiness. not only will that ensure that the world dies from that decay, but you will too. Because that's how salt works. It's either used proactively or it becomes destructive to the one who has it. For example, the Dead Sea. Why is it dead? It's dead because, and nothing can live in it, it's dead because it has such a heavy mineral content that nothing can survive in it. And the reason why it's so salty is that because there's no outlet for the water that flows into it. So the salt water that flows into it can't ever get out. And if it doesn't flow out, that water becomes stagnant. Our bodies can act the same way. If the body doesn't give off salt through perspiration, we start to retain water. We can become bloated, and all kinds of medical complications can follow, including death. So if it's true in nature, if it's true for our bodies, it's also true spiritually. The goal is not to keep ourselves as salty as possible by retreating away from the world, but to keep ourselves as salty as possible so that we can then give that salt to the world. Perhaps even worse than isolation is having no salt or light at all. You know, that person who's a Christian in name only, but the world never seems to feel their salt or their light because their relationship with Christ is so minimal or superficial. You see, that's life on the bench and never getting into the game. And they'll stay on that bench. They'll die on that bench, having never made a single play in the game that we have been called to play. Christianity is not about a life that is informed with certain truths. It's not about a life that's conformed to certain practices and rituals. It's about a life that has been transformed through a relationship with the living God. And when you allow yourself to be transformed, then you become salt and light. You can't help but become salt and light. If you have an authentic Christ relationship, if you are in that relationship with Him, people should sense something about you. They should know that you are not of this world, that there's something different about you. They should pick up that there's something in your relationships, something in your marriage, maybe in your parenting, the way you work, the decisions you make, the values you hold, that they don't have in their life. There should be moments in your day in and day out living, you're interacting with others, you're leading, you're following, that reveal the salt and light of Jesus. And if that's not happening in your life, and it's a choice whether it happens or not, then the world will continue to decay and will continue to grope around in the dark, dark world of sin. And I hope you believe that that is a choice. Each one of us has been given salt and light. It's our decision whether to use it. So if you are truly a follower of Christ, then you would have to suppress that in order not to be salt and light in this world. You'd have to try and keep it buried. Or as Jesus would say, you'd have to put it under a bowl. And let's be honest, many of us do that. Many of us hide our light under a bowl. Some of us do it because we're embarrassed. When others are talking about stuff at work, you're embarrassed to bring up Christ. Or you maybe you just think it's awkward. Or maybe they just don't think they have a responsibility to be the light to those around you. One of the most tragic events in recent American history occurred in New York City in 1964. A young woman from Queens named Kitty Genovese was stabbed to death. Now you might say, what's so tragic about a stabbing? We hear about stuff all the time. I mean, just look at what happened in New Zealand. What makes this so unusual? What makes it unusual is that she was chased by her assailant and attacked 3 times on a public street over the course of a half an hour, while 38 of her neighbors watched from their windows. Not a single person came to her aid. Not a single person shouted out or called for help. Not a single person ran and helped her or came to her rescue. No one even bothered to pick up the phone and call the police. They did nothing except watch. Why? Why would they do that? Psychologists from Columbia University and NYU decided that they wanted to dig deeper and figure out what was going on here. And they figured out, they named what was called the bystander problem. Psychologists decided that they would stage a series of events to try and figure out where this went. And they found out that one single factor determined whether people would respond and help or not. One single factor determined whether people would respond to a need. It wasn't the severity of the crisis. It wasn't the degree to which a person screamed or called out for help. It wasn't even the characteristics of the person in need. It didn't matter whether the person was young or old, male or female, black or white. None of that mattered. What mattered most was how many witnesses there were to the event. The more people who were around, the less people responded. In one of their experiments, they had a student who was alone in a room stage an epileptic seizure. When there was just one person next door listening, that person rushed to the student's aid 85% of the time. But when the test subjects thought that there were as few as 4 others surrounding that also heard of the seizure, they only responded 31% of the time. From an 85% response down to just a 31% response, just because the sense of personal responsibility was spread out. Maybe you've seen yourself in this. You've seen an accident on the road, and you think, well, maybe I should call 911 and report. I'm sure somebody else has already called. When people are in a group, responsibility for taking personal action is diluted. It gets watered down. People assume that someone else will make the call, report the problem, or respond to the need. In the case of Kitty Genovese, social psychologists argue that the lesson isn't that no one called despite the fact that 38 people heard her scream for help. It's that no one called because 38 people heard her scream for help. If she had been attacked on a lonely street with just one witness, she might have lived. That one person may have felt that a sense of obligation to respond. They would have been moved by the fact that it was really up to them. See, Jesus wants to break through the bystander problem. In fact, each of his affirmations in the original Greek begins with the emphatic pronoun you, as if to say, you and only you are the earth's salt. You and only you are the world's light. Each and every one of us has a personal responsibility. There's a great revolution that's been set in motion by God through Jesus for reclaiming this world. You're either in or you're out. You're either being the salt or you have no taste at all. You're either being the light and letting your light shine, or you are just part of the darkness. For those of us who claim to follow Christ, there's a target on the wall. First and foremost, it's reaching out to a lost and dying world with the one and only message that can transform someone's entire eternity. A mission so clear that it's called the Great Commission. The light we are to bring without shame, without awkwardness, without reserve. But with the Great Commission also comes a cultural commission to work toward the kingdom of God taking hold on this planet, and the governments and institutions, our judicial systems and the media. That kingdom is meant to come. That's the salt that we are to bring, which means that the real Christian is always a revolutionary. They are always a radical. They are always dangerous. After all, that's how they described Jesus. He was a revolutionary. He was a radical, and he was dangerous to the people of his day. Can the same be said for us? Jesus says to each and every one of us, you are the salt. So be that salt. You are the light. So let your light shine. Let me bring this home. Let me make it real. Right now, you've got friends at work, people who live on your street, acquaintances at the gym, who you know are one invitation away from coming to hear what Jesus can do in their life. Are you going to invite them? Right now, this church is attempting to support ministries here in this area that serve orphans, widows, the human trafficked, the homeless, the hungry. Are you being generous financially in a way that lets us do that to our fullest potential? Right now, are you even thinking about social justice issues? Does your heart break over sexism and racism in this world? Right now, are you praying? If we live in a world where there's more violence, more injustice, more racism, more division, more perversion, more crime, more hate, couldn't it be because we're not praying enough? Right now, you interact with all kinds of people in all kinds of different ways. What do they notice about you? What do they think about you? Do they know that there is something different about you? Do they sense something about you that's not of this world, or do they simply see one more person who's very much like the world around you, or maybe more so? Right now, people are serving here at TAF in a way that makes a difference, changing a child's life, putting marriages back together, strengthening families, caring for the poor, visiting the elderly, stocking food pantries, conveying the message of Jesus Christ to those with questions and doubts. Are you going to sit back and be a consumer week after week, watching everyone else get involved and help move that ball down the field? Or are you going to get off the bench and get in the game and help us do that work. And don't tell me you don't know how. Don't tell me it looks like you already have everything covered. Don't tell me that you're not needed. Those are excuses, and you're denying that you are, in fact, salt and light. That is the bystander problem. Don't let there be a Kitty Genovese out there that you could have helped, but you thought someone else was going to. What kind of excuse would it be to stand before Jesus one day and hear him say, "Why weren't you in the game?" And your answer is, "Well, nobody asked me." You don't have to be asked to be in the game. Jesus tells us to be the salt and to be the light. He tells us that we have to get into the game. You don't have to be asked to do that. Jesus didn't say that the government was the light of the world. He didn't say that education was, that the marketplace was, that the court system or the media. None of those things are the light of the world. He said, you are the light of the world. Acting as an individual right where you are. And as each of us does that, we can impact this community. We can change the culture in this community if we all are salt and light. If you want to be that salt, if you want to be that light, and I hope everyone does, will you please stand as I pray for us? Heavenly Father, Lord, I just want to thank you. I want to thank you that we don't have to guess about what we are to do in this world. We don't have to imagine what our role is, that we don't have to wait for somebody to ask us to do something. Thank you that you told us straightforward that we are the salt and the light, that we have a role to play that only I can do, that only each person here can do. Help us, Lord. Help us to get past whatever fears we might have. Help us not to cover that light with the bowl. Help us to get off the bench and get into the game and to impact others for you.